For centuries, Italians believed they understood their own ancestry. But in 2025, groundbreaking DNA research revealed something shocking. The genetic foundation of Italian identity is far more complex, far more Eastern, and far older than anyone realized. And it all started 2,000 years before anyone thought it did. When we think about Italy, we think about Roman legions marching across Europe, about the Renaissance masters creating immortal art, about thousands of years of continuous civilization shaping Western culture. We think of Italians as distinctly Italian, a people whose identity runs deep, whose roots are planted firmly in European soil. But the truth, as it turns out, is far more complicated and infinitely more fascinating than any textbook ever told us. For generations, historians and geneticists alike accepted a straightforward narrative about how Italy became genetically what it is today. They believed that the Italian Peninsula, particularly in its central regions, maintained a relatively stable genetic population throughout the Iron Age and into the early Republican period. This population was primarily European, sharing genetic similarities with other Central and Western European groups. Then came the Roman Empire. As Rome expanded its power across the Mediterranean, as it conquered territories in Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and beyond, people from these distant lands migrated to Rome. Some came seeking opportunity in the greatest city the world had ever known. Others came as slaves, as merchants, as administrators serving the empire's vast bureaucratic machinery. This migration, historians believed, fundamentally altered the genetic landscape of central Italy, introducing Eastern Mediterranean ancestry into the population in a sudden, dramatic shift. In July of 2025, a team of international researchers published findings that fundamentally challenged this accepted timeline. The study, appearing in the journal Genome Biology and Evolution, examined the DNA of a late Republican individual discovered at Villa Falgari in Tarquinia, just 70 kilometers from Rome. Using ancient DNA analysis, researchers dated this individual to somewhere between 341 and 53 BCE, placing them squarely in the final centuries of the Roman Republic, well before the establishment of the empire. What they found in this individual's genome was extraordinary. Clear, undeniable evidence of Eastern Mediterranean genetic ancestry. This wasn't supposed to be there. Not yet. Not for another century or more. But it was. And that single discovery forced scientists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about when and how Eastern Mediterranean peoples began mixing with the Italian population. The skeleton at Villa Falgari wasn't an anomaly. When researchers examined other late Republican skeletons from the same region, they found the same pattern. These weren't genetic outliers. They were part of an ongoing process that had begun far earlier than anyone had realized. A genetic transition that was already underway during the late Republican period, perhaps 200 years before the rise of the empire that history books credit with bringing it about. To understand the significance of this discovery, we need to understand what scientists mean when they talk about Eastern Mediterranean ancestry. They're not describing a simple cultural identity or a geographic origin. They're describing specific genetic components that can be traced back through ancient DNA analysis to populations that lived in Anatolia, Greece, the Levant, and surrounding regions thousands of years ago. These ancient populations carried genetic markers, particular versions of genes and alleles that can be tracked through time and across populations. When modern populations carry these markers, scientists can identify them and measure how much of that ancient ancestry they possess. The Eastern Mediterranean ancestry that appears in Imperial Rome contains genetic components that trace back to populations carrying what scientists call Iran, Neolithic, and Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry. These aren't modern populations, of course. These are ancient genetic signatures, echoes of peoples who lived millennia ago. But when you sequence the DNA of someone from ancient Rome, you can see these echoes. You can measure them. You can track their patterns through the population over time. Eastern Mediterranean genetic ancestry began appearing in the late Republican period, perhaps starting around 200 BCE or even earlier. This fundamentally changes how we understand the dynamics of Roman society during the Republic's final centuries. Rome was already becoming genetically cosmopolitan decades before it became politically cosmopolitan as an empire. The researchers who conducted this study used sophisticated population genetics techniques to reach their conclusions. They extracted DNA from the molar root of the Villa Folgari individual, carefully processed it to remove contamination, and sequenced it to create a genetic profile. They then compared this profile to hundreds of other ancient and modern DNA samples from across Europe and the Mediterranean. Using principal component analysis, they plotted where this individual fell relative to other populations. The results were striking. The Villa Folgari individual clustered not with other Iron Age and Republican Italians, but rather shifted dramatically toward Eastern Mediterranean populations. This individual's genetic profile was more similar to people from the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant than to their contemporary neighbors. When researchers used a technique called admixture analysis to break down the genetic ancestry into component parts, they found something remarkable. The Villa Falgari individual carried a high proportion of genetic ancestry traceable to Iran, Neolithic, and Caucasus hunter-gatherer sources. The same components that characterize imperial period individuals. This wasn't a different genetic signature. This was the same genetic signature appearing 2 centuries before it was supposed to appear, based on the old historical model. But the researchers didn't stop there. They looked at the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA of this individual as well. The Y chromosome, which passes from father to son, essentially unchanged, except for rare mutations, revealed a haplogroup that clustered with Bronze Age individuals from Armenia. The mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to offspring, matched a haplogroup found in Greek colonies. These paternal and maternal lineages both pointed toward Eastern Mediterranean origins. This was someone whose ancestry couldn't be explained by the standard model of a stable local population. The really significant finding came when researchers analyzed not just the Villa Falgari individual, but all the late Republican individuals with this Eastern Mediterranean genetic signature. They found several of them scattered through central Italy. These individuals with similar genetic profiles showed Y chromosome lineages that traced to Anatolia, the Middle East, and Greece. Some carried paternal lineages now common in the Middle East, but found in ancient Eastern Mediterranean populations. Others carried the J1 and T haplogroups, now observed mostly in Middle Eastern populations, but documented among ancient Mediterranean peoples. These weren't isolated cases. These weren't genetic anomalies that could be easily dismissed as outliers. When researchers looked at the broader pattern, they could see that these Eastern Mediterranean individuals were part of an ongoing systematic gene flow into central Italy that was already well underway by the late Republican period. The question then became, when did this process actually begin? How far back did it extend? To answer this question, the research teams performed sophisticated admixture analysis on individual skeletons from central Italy, spanning the period from 900 BCE to 300 CE. This analysis broke down each individual's genetic ancestry into 4 main components that scientists know contributed to the peopling of Europe: ancestry from Serbia Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, from Anatolian Neolithic farmers, from Bronze Age steppe populations, and from Iran Neolithic populations. By tracking how these components changed over time, they could see genetic patterns emerging that were invisible when looking at individual skeletons alone. What they found was remarkable. The Anatolian Neolithic component remained stable throughout the entire period, as expected, since that ancestry had arrived in Italy with the spread of farming thousands of years earlier. The Serbian Mesolithic and Steppe Bronze Age components remained relatively consistent as well during the early Iron Age. But then, starting around 200 BCE, something changed. The Iran Neolithic component, which had been minimal in earlier populations, began to increase sharply. This increase accelerated and continued through the imperial period. By the time of the fully established Roman Empire, the Iran Neolithic component had become a significant part of the genetic makeup of central Italian populations. This pattern was the smoking gun. It showed that the genetic transition attributed to the Roman Empire actually began during the late Republican period, roughly 200 years before the empire's establishment. Rome didn't suddenly become genetically cosmopolitan when Augustus established the empire in 27 BCE. Rome was already in the process of becoming genetically cosmopolitan. The empire may have accelerated the process, may have intensified it, but it didn't initiate it. The implications of this timeline shift are profound. They suggest that the movement of Eastern Mediterranean peoples into central Italy began not primarily as a result of Roman imperial expansion, but rather during Rome's expansionist phase as a republic. When Rome conquered Macedonia and Greece between 168 and 146 BCE, when it annexed Anatolia in 133 BCE, when it took control of Syria in 64 BCE, these weren't abstract political events. They were moments that brought previously distant populations into the Roman political sphere. And when populations come into contact through conquest and political integration, people move, soldiers travel, merchants establish trade networks, administrators are posted to new territories, captives and slaves are transported. These mundane, everyday movements of people across political boundaries can add up to significant demographic shifts over time. But the researchers identified another possible mechanism for this genetic transition, one that history books often overlook. Southern Italy had been colonized by Greeks and Phoenicians centuries earlier. These settlements, collectively known as Magna Graecia, had become centers of wealth, power, and sophistication. They had their own genetic composition, shaped by centuries of intermixture between colonists from Greece and Phoenicia and local populations. When Rome conquered and integrated southern Italy into its political system, particularly after the Punic Wars, people from these regions could move more freely throughout the peninsula. They could migrate north to Rome and central Italy, seeking opportunity and fortune. The genetic ancestry that had developed in southern Italian Greek colonies over centuries could thus spread into central Italy through internal migration, long before the empire even existed. This possibility is particularly intriguing because it suggests that the genetic transformation of Italy was not simply the result of long-distance migration from the distant eastern Mediterranean, but rather the result of local intra-Italian population movements that had accumulated over time. It's a more nuanced picture than the simple model of distant peoples flooding into Rome after the empire was established. It suggests that Italy was already genetically diverse and cosmopolitan in important ways before Augustus became emperor. The research team also examined what happened to this Eastern Mediterranean genetic ancestry over time, particularly how it was distributed across different regions and time periods. They found that the ancestry showed a gradient. Some late Republican individuals were nearly entirely of Eastern Mediterranean genetic origin, while others showed mixtures of local Italian and Eastern Mediterranean ancestry. This gradient suggests that the process wasn't uniform. It wasn't that everyone in central Italy suddenly gained Eastern Mediterranean ancestry. Rather, Eastern Mediterranean individuals, or people of mixed ancestry, were integrating into central Italian populations at varying rates and in varying degrees. The researchers modeled this integration using statistical tools designed to estimate admixture between populations. They found that imperial period individuals could generally be modeled as mixtures of the main Central Italian Iron Age and Republican populations with the more Eastern Mediterranean shifted individuals from the late Republic. This modeling suggested that intermarriage and genetic mixing between these groups had been occurring, and that this admixture was continuing and intensifying during the imperial period. The significance of this pattern extends beyond pure population genetics. It speaks to the social history of Rome and Italy. It tells us that Rome was a cosmopolitan society far earlier than we might have assumed. It tells us that Eastern Mediterranean peoples were integrating into Italian society, marrying into Italian families, having children who carried both ancestries well before the height of imperial power. Rome's legendary multiculturalism wasn't something that appeared suddenly with the empire. It was already present during the Republic, already shaping the society that would become the empire. When we look at what this research reveals about Italian identity, we see something complex and multi-layered. Modern Italians don't carry a single, simple ancestry. They carry the accumulated genetic legacy of thousands of years of migration, conquest, trade, and cohabitation. They carry ancestry from Neolithic farmers who came from Anatolia 10,000 years ago. They carry ancestry from Indo-European peoples who migrated from the steppes 5,000 years ago. They carry ancestry from local hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe before any farming or herding existed. And they carry Eastern Mediterranean ancestry that arrived through multiple routes and over multiple centuries, some through long-distance migration, some through trade and cultural contact, some through conquest and its aftermath. The traditional model of Italian ancestry had suggested a kind of genetic purity interrupted by empire, a stable European population suddenly changed by the influx of foreigners when Rome became an empire. But the 2025 study reveals something different, a population that was already mixing, already receiving migrants, already becoming genetically cosmopolitan during the late Republic. This process intensified during the empire, but it didn't originate there. This finding also has implications for how we understand Roman history more broadly. When we read about the Punic Wars, about Rome's conquest of Greece and Anatolia, these weren't just military and political events. They were demographic events. They set in motion the movement of peoples that would gradually transform the genetic landscape of central Italy. The soldiers who marched east came back changed, some carrying partners or children from conquered territories. The administrators, posted to distant provinces, eventually returned to Rome, bringing with them people they'd met and connections they'd formed. The merchants who traded with Eastern Mediterranean cities married and settled, establishing families that carried genetic ancestry from multiple regions. The Villa Folgari individual represents one moment in this much longer process. They represent someone who lived in a time of transition when the old pattern of a relatively homogeneous Italian population was already beginning to give way to the more cosmopolitan Rome of the imperial period. They may have been born to an Eastern Mediterranean parent and an Italian parent. They may have been born in the Eastern Mediterranean and migrated to Italy as an adult. We can't know the details of their life from their bones and DNA, but we know that they existed and that they were not alone. They were part of a pattern, part of a process, part of the transformation of Italy that history books attributed to a different era entirely. What makes this research particularly significant is not just what it reveals about the past, but what it tells us about how science works. The standard model of Italian genetic history seemed reasonable. It aligned with the political history of Rome. It made intuitive sense. But when scientists actually looked at the DNA of individuals who lived during the late Republic, they found something that contradicted this reasonable model. This is how science progresses. We form hypotheses based on the best evidence we have. Then we gather new evidence, and sometimes that evidence tells us we need to revise our understanding. The researchers who conducted this study were transparent about the limitations of their work. They acknowledge that relatively few skeletons from late Republican Italy have been analyzed for ancient DNA. They note that the sample size is small, that future discoveries might refine or adjust the conclusions. They recognize that more work needs to be done, particularly examining skeletal remains from southern Italy and Sicily to fully understand the patterns they've identified. This scientific humility is important. It reminds us that this research represents an advance in our understanding, but not necessarily a final answer. The study has implications that extend far beyond academic interest in ancient genetics. It speaks to fundamental questions about identity and ancestry that matter to many people. For Italians in Italy and the diaspora around the world, ancestry is deeply meaningful. Understanding where one's ancestors came from is part of understanding oneself. The 2025 study suggests that the answer to the question, where do Italians come from, is more complicated than once thought. The answer includes Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, arriving through multiple routes and over multiple time periods, not just the sudden influx attributed to the Roman Empire. Italy's incredible contributions to Western civilization emerged not from genetic purity, but from the diverse mix of peoples who called the peninsula home. The art, the philosophy, the engineering, the law that emerged from ancient Rome were created by people who carried genetic ancestry from across Europe and the Mediterranean, people whose ancestors had come from many different places and mixed together. Italy's incredible contributions to Western civilization emerged not from genetic purity, but from the diverse mix of peoples who called the peninsula home. The art, the philosophy, the engineering, the law that emerged from ancient Rome were created by people who carried genetic ancestry from across Europe and the Mediterranean, people whose ancestors had come from many different places and mixed together. The Villa Folgari study also provides a model for how future genetic research might refine our understanding of other historical populations. It demonstrates that ancient DNA can provide information that historical records miss or obscure. The historical record tells us about emperors and generals, about armies and politics. But ancient DNA can tell us about ordinary people, about how they moved, whom they married, how populations changed over generations. This is a powerful tool for understanding human history in its fullest complexity. Looking forward, researchers have identified several important next steps. They want to sequence more individuals from southern Italy and Sicily to understand how the genetic composition of Magna Graecia may have differed from that of central Italy and how this affected population dynamics. They want to examine more late Republican individuals to better understand the pattern of Eastern Mediterranean immigration and admixture. They want to extend their analysis to other regions of Italy to see whether the pattern they've identified in central Italy is replicated elsewhere. The story that emerges from the 2025 research is one of constant motion, constant mixing, constant change. This is the real history of Italy, far more interesting and dynamic than the simplified narratives found in textbooks. It's a history of peoples moving across the Mediterranean, of conquest and its aftermath, of trade and cultural contact, of marriages and families that carried multiple ancestries. It's a history that began not with the Roman Empire, but centuries earlier, with Rome's expansion as a republic into territories whose peoples would gradually become integrated into Italy's demographic composition. The revelation that Italian genetics are more complex than previously understood, that Eastern Mediterranean ancestry arrived during the late Republic rather than with the establishment of the empire, is ultimately a revelation about the fundamental nature of human populations. They're not static. They're not pure. They're constantly changing through the ordinary movements of people across landscapes and through political boundaries. Understanding this, understanding that the familiar becomes unfamiliar when we look closely enough, is part of what makes ancient DNA research so powerful. It forces us to reconsider the narratives we've inherited, to look more carefully at the evidence, to remain open to being surprised by what the data reveals. And in Italy's case, the data reveals a population far more cosmopolitan, far more connected to the broader Mediterranean world, and far more genetically complex than anyone previously realized.